Al Dickens, Temple 25, and the New World of Islam. Newark, New Jersey, late 1960s into the mid-1970s, produced one of the most structured and sustained armed robbery enterprises in the region's history, operating under the name New World of Islam, headquartered at Temple 25 on South Orange Avenue. The organization emerged as a breakaway sect from the Nation of Islam, adopting elements of black nationalist ideology, economic separatism, and strict internal discipline, while simultaneously developing a centralized command structure that law enforcement would later characterize as paramilitary in function and execution. At the center of this structure was Alfred Al Dickens, known internally as the General, a title that reflected both authority and operational control. Dickens was not simply a symbolic leader. Testimony and court records consistently positioned him as a coordinating figure in planning, approving, and directing criminal activity tied to the organization's funding strategy. Unlike loosely organized street crews operating independently, the New World of Islam functioned through a defined hierarchy: generals, captains, lieutenants, and soldiers, each assigned roles that extended beyond religious participation into logistical and tactical execution. This hierarchy allowed for coordinated operations across multiple locations, particularly in northern New Jersey, with Newark as its base. The central objective of the organization was not random criminal gain. Evidence presented in multiple prosecutions indicated that proceeds from robberies were pooled and redirected toward long-term goals, including land acquisition in places such as South Carolina and rural New Jersey. The intent, according to testimony, was to establish self-sufficient black-controlled communities outside the dominant economic system. To finance this objective, the group carried out a sustained campaign of armed robberies beginning in the late 1960s and accelerating into the early 1970s. These robberies targeted banks, liquor stores, and commercial establishments. Law enforcement investigations would ultimately attribute well over 100 robberies to members and associates of the organization, though exact totals vary depending on the source and prosecutorial scope. Operationally, the robberies followed repeatable patterns. Participants were assigned specific roles prior to execution: entrymen, crowd control, cash handlers, and drivers. Getaway routes were pre-planned, often involving vehicle switching to evade identification. Clothing changes and weapon disposal protocols were incorporated into the escape phase. The level of planning and repetition suggests not opportunistic crime, but systematized activity refined over time. Participants referred to these robberies as missions, a term that reinforced the ideological framing of criminal acts as necessary actions in service of a broader objective. This framing was critical to maintaining internal cohesion and justification, particularly as violence escalated. Despite the structure, the robberies were not consistently non-lethal. Confrontations during these operations resulted in shootings, both fatal and non-fatal, involving civilians and law enforcement. The organization's use of firearms as a standard component of robbery execution increased the likelihood of escalation during any resistance. In addition to external violence, the group was also linked to internal enforcement measures, including intimidation and suspected retaliatory acts against perceived disloyalty. While documentation varies, Testimony in later cases suggested that discipline within the organization was strictly enforced, reinforcing the command authority of leadership. A major escalation in public visibility occurred in 1973 with the murder of James Shabazz, a prominent figure within the Nation of Islam in Newark. Multiple members of the New World of Islam were convicted in connection with the killing. Although Dickens was charged, he was ultimately acquitted of direct involvement in planning the murder. The case, however, intensified scrutiny on the organization and contributed to its public association with targeted violence beyond robbery. By the mid-1970s, law enforcement agencies, including local police and federal investigators, had begun consolidating cases against members of the group. The scale and pattern of robberies, combined with overlapping personnel, made it possible to construct broader conspiracy prosecutions rather than isolated criminal cases. In 1976, the killing of Montclair Police Sergeant Alfred Selleck during a robbery further intensified pressure on the organization. Individuals connected to the New World of Islam were implicated, reinforcing law enforcement's position that the group represented a sustained and organized threat rather than a series of unrelated crimes. Investigations during this period also revealed aspects of internal training and recruitment. Testimony indicated that members were instructed in firearms use and coordinated action, and that younger individuals were introduced into the organization's structure, though the extent and formality of such recruitment remains debated across sources. As prosecutions expanded, the government relied increasingly on cooperating witnesses, many of whom were former members or associates. Their testimony outlined the chain of command, the pooling of robbery proceeds, and the role of leadership figures, including Dickens, in directing operations. These cases marked the beginning of the organization's collapse. Arrests disrupted operational continuity, and the loss of key personnel weakened the ability to conduct coordinated robberies at scale. The same centralized structure that enabled efficiency also made the organization vulnerable once leadership and communication lines were penetrated. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the New World of Islam's robbery network had been effectively dismantled through a combination of prosecutions, internal fractures, and sustained law enforcement pressure. Numerous members received lengthy prison sentences, removing them from active participation and further eroding the organization's capacity. Dickens himself remained a central figure in both the rise and fall of the organization. While not convicted in every major act attributed to the group, his position as leader of Temple 25 placed him at the center of its operational and ideological direction during its most active period. The legacy of the New World of Islam remains complex. From a law enforcement perspective, it stands as one of the more organized and sustained robbery enterprises in New Jersey history, notable for its structure, discipline, and scale. From the perspective of some former members, it represented an attempt, however flawed or violent, to pursue autonomy, economic independence, and collective identity in a period marked by systemic inequality and urban unrest. What distinguishes the organization is not simply the number of robberies committed, but the integration of ideology, hierarchy, and criminal activity into a single operational model. The New World of Islam did not operate as a conventional street gang, nor as a purely religious institution, but as a hybrid structure in which belief and violence were directly linked through a defined strategic objective. In that sense, the story of Al Dickens and Temple 25 is not only about crime, it is about how ideology can be operationalized, how structure can amplify impact, and how movements, when pushed into confrontation with the state, can evolve into something far more dangerous and far more consequential than their origins might suggest.